Welcome to Autism Understanding and Awareness, Part 1, What is Autism? In the first part of this course, we will begin our journey looking at what autism is and begin to understand how our thinking has evolved over time. We will look at how our theoretical knowledge has developed as our understanding of autism deepens. We will also start to explore autism as a developmental difference. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, and it changes the way an individual interacts, views, and processes the world around them. This means that autistic people may see and feel things differently to others. Autism is a lifelong condition, and there is no cure or medication. Being autistic is an important part of someone's identity, and while some people will have more subtle differences, others will have complex needs requiring more intensive support. The characteristics typically associated with autism are often as a result of differences in thinking and processing information. It is through a deep understanding of the impacts of these different thinking styles that we're able to develop our understanding. We will begin our journey into discovering what autism is by looking at the evolution of our thinking around autism and its origins in history. We will begin in the 1940s with the work of Leo Kanner. Kanner has largely been seen as the forefather of autism. However, when we look further back, there may have been many documented accounts of people throughout history who we might now consider to be autistic. Kanner was a German psychologist who during the 1940s was working within Johns Hopkins University in America. Kanner noted within the children that attended his clinic, there were a group who didn't fit any of the diagnostic criteria for other childhood conditions known at the time. At this time, children who presented in the way Kanner writes would have been institutionalized and likely received a diagnosis of infantile schizophrenia. He noted that this small group of children, in his words, lacked social instinct or orient towards other people. They had a need for consistency and appeared resistant to change. He went on to publish a paper in 1943 where he first mentions the newly coined diagnosis of infantile autism, deriving from the Greek word autos, which means self. But Kanner describes autism in very narrow terms and as a condition of deficit and negativity. It is also around this time in Vienna, Austria, that Hans Asperger was also working with a small group of children who presented with a wide range of cognitive and social differences. In 1944, he publishes a paper in German describing a small group of these children as having similar characteristics to those that Kanner described. However, it appears Asperger's definition is much broader, as the children that he were working with were often fluent and eloquent communicators. However, Asperger's paper goes largely unrecognized until some of his work is translated. And Lorna Wing starts to explore the concept of autism being viewed as a spectrum condition. And it is through this that she notes that the children that Asperger was working with had that one characteristic that differed from the children that Kanner had been describing, and that was that they had no delay or difference in communication. And in 1981, she coins the term Asperger's syndrome. Lorna Wing contributed to our understanding of autism probably more than any other modern clinician. She was a huge figurehead in the field of autism. And together with Judith Gould, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, their work really changed our perception and understanding of autism. Wing helped to debunk the idea that autism was structured around a narrow set of diagnostic criteria, but that in fact it was much broader than that. In 1979, Wing and Gould screened more than 900 children as part of a study and began to recognize certain characteristics and group them according to 3 distinct categories. These were social interaction, communication, and imagination. As Gould says, we developed the idea of a triad for impairments characterized by patterns of social interaction, social communication, and social imagination, each with their own subgroup and each with their own uniqueness. This work, when replicated in adults, also led to the development of the concept of theory of mind in autism, and we'll revisit this later. It has been widely accepted that Kanner was maybe the first to discover autism. However, in recently discovered papers, it's found that it may have been Hans Asperger. In 1938, 5 years before Kanner publishes his paper, Asperger had already begun to write about his children and used the term autistic psychopathy to describe them. However, in 2018, it's discovered that Hans Asperger had a strong affiliation with pro-Nazi groups in Austria and Germany. However, Asperger's work cannot be underestimated in terms of how it shaped our understanding and thinking of autism. It took until 1994 for Asperger's to be recognised as a diagnosis in itself within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. However, in 2013, Asperger's was removed from the DSM and replaced by the term autism spectrum disorder. And in 2018, the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases, also follows suit and removes the term in favour of the more overarching diagnosis. The revelations about Asperger's and the removal of Asperger's syndrome from the DSM are likely to have widespread impact on the autistic community in terms of identity, and there are currently ongoing discussions as to whether or not we should indeed continue to use the term Asperger's. But we should also recognise that individual identity is incredibly important. We should always, where possible, reflect the language and terminology an individual wishes to use to describe their diagnosis. Autism is usually diagnosed in childhood. However, a great many people are not diagnosed until adulthood. Diagnosis is the formal process for identifying that an individual has autism. A diagnosis is usually reached by a multidisciplinary diagnostic team, often including a speech and language therapist, pediatricians, psychiatrists. However, other professionals can also be involved. It can include observations of the child or the young person in a variety of settings, and often parents and carers will be asked questions relating to their child's development. It is quite common for an individual to go through life without needing or seeking a diagnosis, and the decision to seek one is often a deeply personal one. Typically, if an adult is pursuing a diagnosis, they will be seen by a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, having first been referred by their GP or other mental health professional. A number of diagnostic tools may also be used to determine if the person has autism, and they may be asked to bring along someone with them who knew them during childhood, such as a parent or older sibling. The characteristics of autism vary from one person to another, but according to the diagnostic manuals, in order for a diagnosis to be made, a person will usually be assessed as having persistent difficulties in social communication and social interaction, and restricted and repetitive behaviours, activities or interests since early childhood, to the extent that these limit or impair everyday functioning. Getting a timely or thorough assessment and diagnosis can be helpful for a number of reasons. It can help autistic people, their families, partners, employees, colleagues, teachers, friends, to understand why they may experience certain differences and how they can support them. Obtaining a diagnosis can also enable people to access the appropriate services and support that will enable them and their families to lead happy, healthy, and fulfilling lives. Currently, in the UK, it's suggested 1% of the population have a diagnosis of autism, so approximately 1 in 100. However, this does not account for the number of autistic people who do not have or wish to seek a diagnosis. To put that in context, in the 1970s, it was around 1 in 5,000. This increase may be largely due to our increased understanding and awareness of autism, but also better access to diagnosis. And the work of people like Norma Wing cannot be underestimated here, and her contribution to improving the diagnostic criteria of autism. Research suggests that males are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than females. There may be many reasons for this. Autism has, up until very recently, been believed to be more common in males than females. However, thanks to improved access to diagnosis, it's starting to look like this isn't true. There is also greater awareness of girls and women as our knowledge and understanding grows and evolves, and some of the common misconceptions around autistic girls are being overturned. We do still have a significant amount of work to do to ensure autistic women have the same access to resources and support. A person can have many other conditions as well as autism. However, some of the most common may be a learning disability, epilepsy, or a mental health condition. There is increasing awareness of the mental health of some autistic people and that it's being largely underreported, as many struggle to access appropriate support. According to the Mays report in 2019, autistic people are at a significantly higher risk of mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal feelings, compared with the general population. As we have learned, autism will affect people in different ways, and throughout history has been referred to by a number of different terms. This includes autism, autism spectrum disorder, autism spectrum condition, atypical autism, classic autism, Kanner's autism, and some people even use terms such as high functioning or low functioning autism, and of course, Asperger's syndrome. Because of the change to the main diagnostic manuals, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is now most commonly given diagnostic term. However, many clinicians will still use additional terms to help describe a particular autism profile. For example, they may use terms such as pathological demand avoidance. At Scottish Autism, we respect that many differing perspectives on how to comprehend complex differences within the professional literature, and indeed within the autistic and autism community. Our approach is to focus on individual formulation or understanding within a broader, more developmentally informed framework. By that we mean we focus on who the individual is, their history, their wishes, their hopes, their voices, their choice. And by doing this, we can ensure that our approach recognises them as an individual. We should also again recognise that individual identity is incredibly important. We should always be reflecting the language and terminology an individual wishes to use to describe their diagnosis and who they are. For the purposes of this course, we will use the term autism and autistic person. There is a strong movement within the autism and autistic community to use person-first language, to see the person rather than the diagnosis. Here, we're going to start looking at some of the more influential theories published on autism. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but for our learning here today, these are some of the key ones. We will begin in the 1930s and the term refrigerator mother. This was coined by Dr. Leo Kanner, the same Leo Kanner who was largely credited with discovering autism back in the 1940s. It was used to describe a parent whose cold, uncaring demeanour had traumatised her child so much they had retreated into their own world. An expression used at the time to describe an autistic child's presentation. It was at this time, thinking surrounding autism was that it was a mental illness caused by deep childhood trauma. Thankfully, this theory was largely debunked, and it was down to Dr. Bernard Rimland of the Autism Research Institute and his work focusing on better understanding of the causes of autism. He has been widely credited with dismissing the concept of poor parenting causing autism. We then move forward onto the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, Uta Frith, and Alan Leslie, who first started to use the term theory of mind in their work conducted in the mid-80s, when they observed that children with autism were consistently unable to recognise the views of others. And this had led them to recognise that autism had a significant impact on the development of theory of mind. It suggests that autistic people may have difficulties in appreciating the thoughts and feelings of others, or that others indeed have thoughts and feelings that differ from their own. As our thinking has developed, we're moving away from solely seeing understanding as a purely autistic issue, but one of mutual understanding of each other's perspectives, and we'll revisit this theory shortly. We then move forward onto the work of Uta Frith and weak central coherence. Uta Frith was one of the first to suggest that autistic people had a low drive for coherence, or maybe not able to see the big picture. This theory was based on the understanding that most of us are able to grasp the gist of something, a conversation, a story based on a few details. Frith suggested that autistic people are more focused on detail. And again, this is one of the theories that we'll revisit later on in part 2 of this course. We then move forward into the work of Ozanov and executive functioning. This is often and sometimes referred to executive dysfunctioning theory, but for the purposes of this course, we'll drop the dysfunction. Planning, organising, switching focus, and impulse control are all executive functions. This theory suggests that autistic people experience differences in how they organise, sequence, and can have a significant impact on daily living skills, such as self-management, getting dressed, cooking, etc. It is around about this point, as we move forward into the early 2000s, that our thinking is starting to move on from viewing autism as a condition based on deficits and difficulties, and more towards differences, skills, and strengths. And it's not more so with the work of Damien Milton and the double empathy problem. Milton's theory suggests that when people of very different experiences and perspectives of the world interact with one another, they will struggle to empathise. In his work, Damien Milton suggests that this is not just due to autistic cognition, but a breakdown in reciprocity and mutual understanding. Much like if you've ever been on holiday and don't speak the language, you've maybe struggled to make yourself understood, or to even understand the perspective of the other person, and it is likely that they have experienced the same too. It is here that we start to see an even bigger shift in how we view autistic thinking, and it has contributed massively to a change in our practice approach. As we've said, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. So to understand autism, we must first look at the developmental journey a person has been through. We all develop at different ways and in different times. However, there are certain stages of a child's development that are expected to happen within certain periods of a child's life. These are known as developmental milestones, and we will revisit this concept shortly. There are three main areas of development. Feeling or emotional development. This is developing that and expressing a range of emotions appropriately. Moving or motor development, your ability to coordinate your body to move it in different ways. Growing or physical development, developing the ability to use your body in a different way. Thinking or cognitive development, developing your own unique thinking style, problem solving and making decisions. These four areas will overlap with each other. Movement milestones usually do develop first, from a baby grasping, waving, pointing, rolling, and so on. However, development is messy. Some babies skip steps. Take a moment to think about a child you know. When did they sit? Did they crawl, walk, or did they miss a step? So what is a developmental milestone? As we've just said, sitting, walking, talking, developing fine motor skills, the ability to feed yourself, negotiate with others, to see other people's perspectives, or to wait for things to happen. These are all cognitive and physical milestones that babies and young children will reach throughout their development. Most children will follow a typically developmental profile and will reach certain milestones at certain ages. In the further reading section of this course, you'll find more details on these. It's important to remember that developmental stages or milestones are general indicators of development. They indicate general trends in development in children across the world. Each child will develop at their own pace, and as we mentioned earlier, may even skip some steps. When diagnosing a child, or indeed an adult with autism, diagnosticians will ask questions relating to the individual seeking diagnosis having met certain developmental milestones, usually between the ages of 0 and 5. In atypical development, some of these milestones may not have been reached or might be significantly delayed. The difference may be subtle or acute depending on the child. However, in most cases, these differences become more apparent as the child develops and falls further behind their peers. It's here that we can now start to think about an individual's autism profile. And in the following 2 sessions of this course, we'll begin to explore this further. However, for now, let's look at developmental patterns and autism. In this graph, you will see the dark purple line is indicating a scattered or uneven developmental profile. This is sometimes also referred to as a spiky developmental profile. At the top of the graph, you will see the light purple line, around about the age of 10. You will see that this is an indicative developmental profile of a typically developing 10-year-old. You can see that it's quite smooth. The key developmental milestones listed at the bottom are all developing at an even rate. And so by the time the child is 10, he has met all those developmental milestones in relation to his or her peers. In fact, children even with a global developmental delay will still present with a smooth developmental line, indicating that although this child's development is delayed, they are developing these core skills in a unified way. In autism, you can see that the smooth developmental profile is not present. Instead, we see a very uneven pattern, with areas more or less developed compared to the normative. However, it's really important to acknowledge here that we don't over or underestimate someone's ability or lack of based on knowledge of their functioning in one or more area. For example, even if somebody has limited skills in social interaction, you'll see that actually this person has really high skills in gross motor and fine motor skills. It's important to acknowledge and be aware of under and overestimating people's skills. Someone's developmental profile helps make up their autism profile and helps us to develop an understanding of that person and how to adjust our support. There are 3 core areas that we'll start to explore as we start to think about a person's autism profile. These include social imagination and flexibility of thinking, social interaction, and social communication. Over the next sections of this course, we'll begin to unpack what we mean by these and start to explore what this might look like in practice. As well as these 3 areas, it's also important to consider who the person is, their likes and dislikes, personality, sensory needs, and other conditions they may have. It is also important to remember that every autistic person is different. Your next step now is to visit the reflective activity attached to this section of this course. This will help you consolidate your learning. You should also have received details of your virtual classroom date, where we will take some time to reflect on our learning and what it means for our practice. Don't worry if you have questions at this stage. Make a note of them and bring them along to your virtual classroom. Or if you prefer, you can contact your course facilitator directly.